I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest updates from Ukraine, discuss the UK's new DragonFire laser, and I speak to a Ukrainian lieutenant colonel on a military base outside Kyiv on military strategy, the state of training, and how the war may develop if aid from the West dries up.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 12th of April, 2 years and 48 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls and science correspondent Joe Pinkstone. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, hi everybody. So let's start with an update on the Trypillia power plant. So the thermal power plant in Kyiv Oblast that was hit yesterday can be restored with international help, but this will be, quote, futile without more air defence. That comes from Andrei Hota, the chair of Ukraine's state energy company Centrenergo's supervisory board. He was speaking to Voice of America yesterday. Now, the plant was completely destroyed in a Russian attack, or the continuing Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure early yesterday, leading to the total loss of Centrenergo's generating capacity. This plant is about 30k south of Kyiv. It was the main power supplier to Kyiv, Zhytomyr and Cherkasy oblasts. The Russian strike led to a large fire in the turbine house. All the plant's workers who were on shift at the time survived. Mr. Holter said, "We can restore everything, but it will require the help of international partners. Equipment like turbines and transformers come from European countries, but without a sufficient number of missiles for anti-aircraft defence, it will, to put it mildly, be a futile affair." Now, predictably, Putin claimed the attacks on the infrastructure are a response to the strikes on Russian energy facilities. Do we really have to start talking about who fired who first and who invaded who first? And anyway, so forget what he said. But don't worry, the UN leapt into action. Russia's war against Ukraine is, quote, a direct threat to regional stability and international security, and is an existential threat to the people of Ukraine. This is UN Assistant Secretary General Myroslav Yenka speaking yesterday at the Security Council session. That's good to know. Thanks, Mr. Yenka. Well done for turning up. Are you going to do anything about it, I would ask? Oh no, hang on, there's more. He denounced Russia's attacks as unacceptable and called for lasting and comprehensive peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter, international law and resolutions of the General Assembly, blah, 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 respecting the sovereignty, international territorial integrity of Ukraine. That'll do it. Okay, moving on swiftly. The ISW, Institute for the Study of War, US-based think tank, speaking today, says Russia appears to be exploiting Ukraine's degraded air defence umbrella in an attempt to collapse Ukraine's energy grid and constrain Ukraine's defence industrial capacity, while Russian ground forces take advantage of their ability to use airstrikes on Ukrainian frontline positions to make slow but steady gains. The ISW says geolocated footage in the last couple of days shows Russian forces have recently made confirmed, albeit marginal, advances west of Crimea towards Chasiv Yar, that's west of Bakhmut. They went on in their report this morning. ISW continues to assess that sparse and inconsistent air defence coverage along the front has likely facilitated Russia's intensification of guided and unguided glide bomb strikes, which Russian forces used to tactical effect in their seizure of Avdiivka in mid-Feb 24, and which Russian forces appear to be using again during their current offensive operations near Chasiv Yar. So what they're saying is Russia has intensified their strikes as Ukraine's ability to defend the territory has withered. Now, this is what happens when aid is withheld or slowed down. And I think it is now no longer the case that Mike Johnson holding up any possible vote on the $60 billion aid package means everything will grind to a halt in Ukraine and that Kyiv will be forced to negotiate and potentially cede the occupied territories in Crimea. I think it's looking more and more likely that what's happening is Ukraine is going to be pushed back hard and in short order, tactically by glide bombs and the so-called meat assaults, and strategically by not having the means to defend themselves unless it's unlocked. I note the heat that Mike Johnson is under at the moment from Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's threatening to oust him as House Speaker. Donald Trump is set to appear with Mr. Johnson later on today at an election integrity event at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, his resort in Florida. Politico says that Donald Trump is not happy with Marjorie Taylor Greene's threat to throw the Republicans into chaos again by going for another speaker vote. Politico suggests there's a fear that amongst Republicans that an election year speakership battle will undercut the party's goals of keeping the House and flipping the White House and the Senate. They quote one person close to Trump as saying, "It's fair to say we don't think she's being constructive. The internal fighting is not appreciated by Trump." They quote another Trump insider as saying, 100% distraction, unwanted and just stupid. We're not going to get trapped into this cycle of BS that comes out of members of the House. So Mike Johnson in need of a bit of support, which looks like he's going to get from Trump later today, although who knows? Please let me know if you are much closer to US politics than we are, which is pretty much most people listening to this podcast. Inside Ukraine still, Russian forces launched attacks against 11 of Ukraine's oblasts over the past day, killing 5, injuring at least, over a dozen. This is coming from regional authorities across the country earlier today. Russia hit residential buildings in Mykolaiv yesterday, killing 5, injuring at least the same number, Governor Vitaly Kim said. And there were strikes also in Donetsk, Kyiv, Chernihiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Vinnytsia and Khmelnytsky oblasts. Russian glide bombs also damaged a thermal power plant in the Sumy community. The Air Force, Ukraine's Air Force, said they shot down 16 of 17 Shahed drones fired at them overnight, but say Russia also launched a Kh-59 guided missile. Staying inside Ukraine, and Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal said today that the government has allocated an additional 3.88 billion hryvnia, that's almost $100 million for the construction of fortifications, the ongoing work to build defensive lines. This money is primarily for Kyiv and Sumy oblasts. They border Russia. You may remember in January, the Ukrainian government allocated 20 billion hryvnia, just over $500 million for fortifications to be built throughout the rest of this year. And it's just as well, because the Kyiv Independent, quoting a US official who had spoken to Bloomberg, they say the possibility of a collapse of Ukraine's army cannot be ruled out, quote unquote. Now, anyone who knows what they're talking about and has been looking at this war, knows what they're looking at in the war, has never ruled that out, I would suggest. But on the face of it, that comment does suggest a certain complacency among some elements of US officialdom, although obviously there's a health warning there, anonymous sources, we don't know who they are. But it does speak that perhaps there's a view that after Russia's failed assault at the start of 2022, that Putin's maximalist aims of taking over the entire country were impossible, when they are clearly not. I think Francis covered yesterday how US General Christopher Cavoli, who's current SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, warned that Russia has largely replaced its heavy battlefield losses in the war so far and at a much faster pace than anticipated. General Cavoli said the Russian army is now 15% larger than it was when it invaded Ukraine. So there's absolutely no guarantees here, David. A lot of people saying the lines are frozen, there's stalemate. Absolutely not. I mean, we've seen the impact of these glide bombs. We've seen the low moral bar Russia's prepared to accept by pushing meat assaults forward and just losing men in the bid to claim another few metres of territory. So nothing is certain here. And it absolutely is not the case that the collapse of Ukraine's army cannot be ruled out. Far from it. That's enough stuff inside the country, or primarily inside the country. I will turn to international affairs in a moment, David, but I think I better take a break.
Dom Nicholls, thank you very much. We'll come back to you later to talk about the international front. Joe Pinkstone, thank you so much for joining us. Joe, this is a question I didn't think I'd be asking on this podcast, but tell us about DragonFire. What is it?
Yes, thanks for having me. DragonFire is, it's what Grant Shapps called a cutting-edge weapon that he claims is years ahead of anything that anyone else in the international community may have. And in essence, it's a laser. It's a laser that you can target drones with, and Grant Shapps also claims you can target ballistic missiles with it, and it works by locking onto a target, namely drones, and quite literally burning a hole through whatever it comes into contact with. And it was announced yesterday by the Ministry of Defence that by 2027 Royal Navy ships will be fitted with DragonFire, and there is clear ambition from Grant Shapps that this will be sped up, that he will try and deliver this earlier than 2027 into the British arsenal. But it is also clear that he is talking with people in Ukraine and with Ukrainian forces in how this technology may be deployed on the ground in the active conflict. So initially it was targeted with a 2032 deployment date. This has been sped up because the government has essentially been slightly caught off guard by how important drones and drone warfare has been in Ukraine and also the other active conflict that we see globally. And in essence, it's costing tens of thousands of pounds in missiles to shoot down relatively inexpensive drones. And that is what he called an asymmetric piece of warfare, and one that they hoped to level. So the MOD estimates the DragonFire costs about £10 to shoot per shot, and it claims to be able to hit a £1 coin-sized target from a kilometre away. Like I said, it is one laser beam, it's invisible and it's silent. It operates in the near-infrared region of the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's terrible for your eyes, is what they say, but it also is capable of burning through 10mm sheet metal. It's capable of burning through mortars. It's capable of burning through bricks in a matter of seconds. The way it works, just very quickly, it's 37 individual lasers around 1.5 kilowatts. They are all combined into one to make roughly a 55 kilowatt laser beam. The design of the weapon is such that those individual beams combine in what's called constructive interference, and essentially it makes it more than the sum of its parts. It creates a very narrow but very powerful beam of light, and when it comes into contact with a sheet of metal, for example, it creates a 3000 degrees Celsius plasma that within seconds can completely destroy what it comes in contact with. Now, it doesn't set alight the drones, it doesn't cause them to explode necessarily, but it will incinerate whatever it comes into contact with. And the Ministry of Defence is very clear that the navigation of this weapon and the way that it is targeted is so precise as to be able to target, for example, an explosive that is on a drone and therefore allow that to explode. So in one of the tests that they did at Porton Down, which is where I visited yesterday at the Defence and Science Technology Laboratory, they showed us videos of tethered drones and also of mortar shells being exploded within a matter of seconds. So the technology is not fully ready for deployment yet, is what the Secretary of State was saying, and through a refinement of the procurement process, they're hoping that it can be on the ground in Ukraine sooner rather than later, and also not just on ships but also on land. The laser is quite large and requires quite a large amount of support, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility for it to be fitted to a military vehicle, for example, and be driven around. So there are no firm commitments yet. There's nothing concrete from the government on how this could be deployed. It's important to say that they're not sharing the technology with the scientists in Ukraine, but they are focusing on potential delivery as soon as they possibly can. Grant Shapps also said that the electronic warfare is rife currently in the Ukrainian conflict, and radio frequency weapons, which is what this technically falls into as an electronic weapon, is going to be an important frontier going forward. They're also working on what they call an RF gun, a radio frequency gun, which is, by all accounts, it's an electromagnetic pulse, which is of Ocean's 11 fame, and they're hoping to also use that in the near future. That is perhaps further away from active deployment, but the 7th Air Defence Group is going to the air defence experts within the British Army. They're going to get their hands on both of these pieces of technology this summer, and the hope is that they can put it through its paces and try out both DragonFire and the RF gun to see what happens when actually used by the end user.
I mean, that's a fascinating story. I was a little surprised, really, that they'd announced that they would send, just reading your copy, Mr. Shapps says that the UK is planning to add a DragonFire to its arsenal by 2027, but is working to see if it can send prototypes to Ukraine sooner. even if they are not 100% refined. Were you surprised that they released that they told you that? And I mean, I know you said, details are scarce, but do we have any details beyond that potentially these British weapons could be on the ground in Ukraine relatively soon?
So details are very thin. It was of note that they came out quite openly and said the 27 date. It was relatively unprompted. I mean, it had always been said that 2032. So it is clear, and it was clear from both the scientists, the industry sector, and also from the Secretary of State himself, that the current situation of warfare and quite how dominant drones were had really forced the hand here into prioritising perhaps what previously would have been called novel and maybe speculative science. So there has always been an issue in taking science from the labs of government scientists and upscaling that to the point of the battlefield, which I believe is a phrase that's commonly referred to as the Valley of Death. So trying to cross that is extremely difficult. And I think part of the reason we've perhaps been told this information is the need for the government to let it be known that they are tackling that issue, and that not only the expense but also the difficulty of targeting drones is one that is an issue that they're actively trying to tackle.
Joe, thanks so much for joining us here. I've just got a couple of questions, if I may. Right now, treat me gently, okay? I do not understand why, if we took that light bulb out of the ceiling up there, electricity wouldn't drip on our heads. Okay, so that's the level you're dealing with. So treat me gently. But talk to me about this laser. So it's light, yeah? So does that mean it can go on forever? What is stopping it? What's the range, the potential range of this thing? And is it like a bullet that you have to aim off for wind and just the physics of the bullet will drop? So a sniper will aim slightly above the target potentially and into the wind, all that kind of jazz. Is it exactly the same with a laser? Or stop me if I'm getting too technical, but super duper techno stuff that has to happen to work with laser weapons?
So what we know on how this weapon works is limited by the classified information. So the ranges are completely unknown. There is no knowledge on that. However, we can perhaps speculate that if it can hit a target of a £1 coin from a kilometre away, the range is probably within the range of that order of magnitude. You're probably looking at around a matter of kilometres, nothing more than that. The scientists in the room yesterday did say that it disperses in its potency as it spreads beyond that. However, the laser is extremely dangerous. It operates at a wavelength of around 1 to 1.5 microns, which it can burn the layers of your eyes, so it can cause blindness. It's extremely dangerous beyond the fact that it can cause a 3,000 degree plasma. And also, when you're shooting over those distances, it is, of course, it's a ray of light. It's a beam of energy. It isn't a projectile in the same way as a bullet or any other projectile would be. So you don't have to necessarily contend with gravity, like a sniper, for example, but you do have to contend with the atmosphere. So what you are firing this weapon through is the air, it is the atmosphere, and that obviously is also, that's a variable that you can't control for at the point of firing. However, you do know, and we do know, that the atmosphere moves at a fairly consistent rate and quite a predictable rate of around about 1,000 times a second. But you can factor that in, which is the shimmying of the air, and the shimmying of the air that you see on a hot summer's day on perhaps a hot tin roof or on tarmac, that will impact on how light passes in a straight line. And the key for the laser is to keep it in a straight line, obviously, and to keep it going where you are aiming. So they can factor that in, and you can essentially target something very precisely at the level of precision that this weapon touts, while factoring in what you're going through. And that can apply to humidity, it can apply to altitude, temperature will also affect that. So these are all things that they factor in when they're firing the laser. The actual process of creating the laser beam is extremely intricate. So you have 37 different channels, which are essentially 37 slightly different lasers. They are arranged in a hexagonal array, and they all produce one singular, very narrow beam of energy, which goes up to around the 55 kilowatt range of weapon, which is lower than other weapons that we've heard about from perhaps the US and Israel.
Dom, there are more updates from you. Can you talk us through them?
Yes, some international updates, David. So turning on to the international front, Russia's defense ministry says that its forces shot down 4 drones over Rostov Oblast and 1 over Belgorod Oblast last night. Obviously, those are inside Russia. Rostov, the drone, was apparently shot down just after 3 a.m. local time. Regional Governor Vasily Golubev speaking there, he said no casualties or damage, but we've got no way to verify any of those claims. Separately, Ukraine's military intelligence say that Russia is sending troops from Far Eastern military units, including the Pacific Fleet, to replenish personnel losses in Ukraine. Today's update from Ukraine's General Staff says Russia has lost, 451,730, to be precise, troops fighting since the full-scale invasion began. They say Moscow is now deploying personnel of the Pacific Fleet and the 11th Army of the Air Force to replenish losses and staff new military units. The BBC's Russia service, along with Russian independent media outlet Mediazona, says they've confirmed the identities of more than 50,000 Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine. They did this work over the last few weeks. Now, if those numbers are correct, 50,000 killed, circa 450,000 killed, wounded, missing and taken prisoner, that's a 1-to-9 ratio of killed to wounded, basically, or wounded and other, but basically wounded. That, I think, is not correct. So this is not the number of Russian soldiers inside Ukraine, vice how many have been killed, but the likely figures of killed, wounded, missing and captured against 50,000 killed. Given what we've seen about how they are conducting their assaults, I think it's a much higher ratio than 1-to-9 of killed. But, it's very difficult to get any sort of accurate figures here, and they've crunched the numbers there, certainly the Russia service and Mediazona. So, who am I to criticise? But I think it will prove to be slightly higher. Next, now, Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko, he met Putin for a 4-hour meeting late into last night. This comes from Russian state-controlled news agency RAI Novosti. They last met in January, but Lukashenko's quote-unquote press service said earlier yesterday that several topics were going to be discussed, including the coordination of actions in response to existing challenges and threats, and further advancing Belarus-Russia cooperation in various spheres. Okay. Next, now, James Heappey, British MP, still briefly an MP, but who last month stepped down as the Minister for the Armed Forces, so basically the minister underneath the Defence Secretary. There are 4, 5 if you include the Lords and what have you, but 4 main ministers of defence in the British parliamentary setup. You've got the Defence Secretary, and then the sort of second in command, if you like, is Min-AF. And that's what James Heappey was. So Mr. Heappey is going to be leaving Parliament at the next election, but stood down as Min-AF last month. He's been speaking to my friend and colleague Deborah Haynes over at Sky. A couple of things from that. First, he tweeted this morning. He said, quote, "We've got to keep pushing boundaries of our support for Ukraine. We've got to fund defence better with 2.5% of GDP now and 3% by 2030. And we've got to improve our strategic resilience." So, okay, it would have been better if he'd said it whilst in government, but for understandable, slightly dull reasons, he's not going to do that. But he's saying it before he leaves Parliament. So it does still have credibility, I think. Second thing I picked up from him, though, watch his interview and you'd be forgiven for thinking that he's an avid listener of this podcast. He's been almost parroting word for word what we've been saying on some issues. He said the UK and the wider West should consider sending troops to Ukraine to help with training and other support, but he insisted they would have to be kept far away from the front line to avoid sparking a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. When asked about the possibility of Western troops on the ground in Ukraine, he said, "You have got to be careful about how you do it. I think definitely nowhere near a combat zone." Define combat zone. "I think you've got to be very, very careful not to make it into a Russo-NATO war, but I do think it is worth exploring what, in the sort of deeper, in the depth of Ukraine, the donor community could do." It was suggested to Mr. Heappey that British troops could help with training Ukrainian forces inside Ukraine, and he said, "I think it's worth considering." Now, this does echo what we've been saying here. I mean, okay, fine. Maybe we're very prescient and ahead of the curve and all the rest of it, or maybe we're just up on where the state of debate is around the global community in this area. I'll take either, quite frankly. But, it also echoes what I was told by Roman Kostenko, former Ukrainian SBU commander, now an MP, albeit back in green since the start of the full-scale invasion. He's the secretary of the Parliamentary National Security Committee of Ukraine's parliament. Is exactly what he told to me when we were speaking in Ukraine. Worth listening back to that to hear exactly what he said. But speaking of Mr. Kostenko, one of the provisions that he had put into his bill that's currently going through Ukraine's parliament to reduce the age of conscription, plus a load of other bits and bobs, that had to be traded out, has been adopted separately. So today, Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal announced that Ukrainian soldiers and police officers who serve directly at the front, the so-called zero line, are going to receive an additional payment of 70,000 hryvnia a month. That's nearly $1,800 on top of their annual salary of about 25,000 hryvnia, $600 monthly salary, $600, and combat payments of 100,000 hryvnia to $2,500. What it all means, David, is that Ukrainian soldiers today serving at the zero line, trying to hold back the Russian army, one of the greatest land threats to NATO. Yes, there's more stuff there, the air and space forces, Navy, very capable submarine force. But the land threat, which is a big priority for any NATO military, that's what these Ukrainian soldiers are holding back. Well, trying to hold back at the moment, with a salary of just over $4,900 a month. To which I say the West is getting an absolute bargain there if that's what they're willing to put in. And all they can do, seemingly at the moment, the West, is just hope they don't lose. It really is time to ramp up the aid and get that thing shifted through Congress, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom and Joe. Let's go to our final thoughts then. Dom Nicholls.
No, I was off yesterday, but I noticed Francis was talking about our coverage on YouTube. This podcast that goes out on YouTube as well. Francis was talking about the number of Russian bots, trolls and ne'er-do-wells that in the last couple of weeks especially have upped their antics about commenting. Firstly, they're trying to shut down debate, so they don't leave any space for anyone else to comment on the podcast or to get a debate going, a discussion going. They're trying to shut that down. And they're also at the same time trying to spin the narrative by, if enough of them say the same sort of thing in the similar sort of guise, then it might make somebody who's not as close to the issues as we are, that's us and you, everyone listening, it might make them think, oh wow, that's the prevailing opinion. So we've got to fight against that. It is very annoying. We don't want to turn comments off because that's partly what they want. We want to have a lively discussion, but it is incredibly frustrating, and I do accept that, and I just ask you to bear with us. It's designed to make you angry. Don't let them make you angry, please. We've got enough anger. Let's just stick together. So please don't be taken in by that. Do continue to debate, discuss. We've got all the usual methods of contact in the show notes, so please email us directly if you wish. But yes, I think I'm sort of leaning on the side of the right people are taking notice and getting upset by it, and I refuse to get angry by their sort of fairly one-dimensional attempts to shut us down. But yeah, we should be aware that there's quite a concerted information attack against us on audio and video at the moment, David. Please bear with us, and we do appreciate everyone engaging with us.
Well, thank you very much, Dom Nicholls. Thank you, Joe Pinkstone, as well, for coming on, and thank you all for listening. Have a very good afternoon. Coming up, we have an exclusive interview from a commander in Ukraine's presidential brigade on his military base outside Kyiv. Stay tuned. In our recent reporting trip to Ukraine, myself and producer Adelaide Pojman-Ponte ventured outside of Kyiv to a military base in the countryside. We were there to speak to Lieutenant Colonel Pavlo Kurylenko, a commander in the Presidential Brigade. The conversation was wide-ranging and eye-opening. Pavlo shared his thoughts on the situation on the ground to the quality of training his troops were engaged in. Thank you so much to Pavlo for his time and our friends in Ukraine who helped organise the interview. Here's our conversation. Well, thank you so much for your time. Would you start just by introducing yourself and telling us about your brigade?
Мене звати підполковник Kurylenko Pavlo Sergeyevich.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Pavlo Kurylenko, commander of the 20th Separate Special Purpose Battalion of the Presidential Brigade. I started my military journey back in 2014 as a platoon commander and joined the army as a volunteer. For the past 2 years, my brigade has been involved in fighting on the most difficult fronts, like Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Staromayorsk, the so-called Berdyansk projection, and it keeps conducting its military tasks in these areas.
Продовжує виконання своїх бойових завдань.
For people around the world who have never been on the front line, never been at war, how would you explain what soldiers see on zero line, on the front line of some of these most difficult places?
Фронт – це завжди страшно.
A front line is always scary, no matter whether a soldier is a fresh recruit, a well-trained one, or a super experienced sergeant. It's always very scary. Since the very beginning in 2014 until today, we have always encountered overwhelming forces in infantry, artillery and equipment. This is why the realisation that you will 100% be involved in countering overwhelming enemy forces is already a tremendous work on yourself, your mentality and morale to force yourself to perform tasks in extremely hard conditions. Any combat operation follows a more or less standard scenario. There are specially trained groups that conduct specific operations. They come from the second line, from the rear, cross the resistance line, conduct specific tasks like assaults or reconnaissance, scouting, and get back. Though there is also another and more difficult situation, when the guys have to stay a month or two in trenches in direct contact with the enemy, having no rotation. This is a different category of soldiers.
What challenges does he find as a commander?
Дуже важливим моментом є
A combination of military and moral training is very important. It's vital to have a clear understanding that these two components must work together. In case they go apart, everything collapses. One more important thing is feeding the soldiers well. This is really a very painful issue. Food is the same everywhere. A potato is a potato here, in Britain, the US or else. It is just the same. Though the way it's cooked and served helps make soldiers feel more at home. And it's super important, so we pay lots of attention to that.
неймовірно велику увагу.
Could you give us an example of the kind of things the soldiers really like to eat then that reminds them of home?
Тушковане м'ясо.
Stewed meat and baked potatoes. They love that very much.
Could you tell us about the state of training for your troops and where they're trained at the moment? Is it with NATO countries, through Interflex? What's happening for your brigade?
Можу розповісти.
I can tell you about it. Yes, they're getting trained. The day before yesterday, a group of 75 soldiers just got back from the UK. Before that, my Chiefs of Staff, Reconnaissance and Planning Group undertook NATO courses in Latvia. All of them were trained within their groups, and all the three were recognised the best within their group. The Chief of Staff became number one of the entire course.
Начальник штабу взагалі першим на курсі.
What's his view on the standard of training then? Is it exactly what they need?
Я впевнений,
I am sure that this training will create a new approach within NATO, and it's going to be based in Ukraine. I'm going to explain to you why. The issue is that there are two absolutely different approaches. We mostly used a post-Soviet one, though NATO has got one of its own. The Soviet approach is based on a battalion taking a position for defence, conducting reconnaissance with further deployment of units in the directions where the enemy was spotted. According to NATO standards, the first thing to be done is gathering information about the enemy, then estimating its own resources, including them into the technical and tactics characteristics, and then calculating how to use them regarding the data about the enemy collected. That is, the entire game goes based on the information about the enemy. For instance, let's simulate a situation based on the Soviet approach. You are told that there is a settlement called Novoselivka, and ordered to take a defensive position there. So you do it first, and only after that you start looking where a machine gun or an AGS grenade launcher of the enemy forces are located. According to NATO, it's quite the opposite. You get the information of where the AGS grenade launcher is located first, you start estimating how you're going to repel it, and make your own moves based on the data about the enemy. The difference is that the Soviet strategy implied working from defence to eventually gradual offensive, and the NATO strategy implies imminent offensive and repelling the enemy forces until taking their positions. Though both strategies have huge drawbacks. When it comes to the Soviet one, taking a defensive position is all right, though the possibility of further reconnaissance and advances, taking into consideration potential losses, is quite controversial. When we speak about the NATO approach, it implies huge amounts of gear to be applied, up to a helicopter per soldier. NATO strategy says, here you have data covering the military potential of the enemy, so you have to use that and that and that to counter it. A number of measures that will assure beating the enemy. However, it doesn't imply the scenario when such means, weapons, are absent. Still, the defence area should be taken anyway, no matter if these means are at the disposal or not. Here, the NATO approach doesn't have any other plan for a manoeuvre. This is why I believe that combination of these two approaches, some sort of a compromise, can help create a different system for both defensive and offensive actions.
Інша система оборони і наступу.
You mentioned the number of soldiers, 85 to the UK, 3 officers to Latvia. It strikes me that that number in the future will have to go much higher, considering the number of soldiers needed to fight this war. Is that an issue that you find, sending soldiers away from the front to train?
Поїхало.
The total number of personnel that left for training is 400. That's the number of people just from our brigade. 75 of them are mine. The groups are big, though can they cover the general demand? The answer is no. Still, must the general demand be covered at the expense of those sent to Britain or Latvia? The answer is no. NATO trainers cannot operate on that scale inside Ukraine without being targeted by missiles.
Ракетні удари вони не зможуть займатися.
So in terms of the future, in terms of building up that capacity, are you telling the Brits and other NATO countries that needs to happen now? Because 85 soldiers is good, but you need hundreds and hundreds.
В загальному
In general, it seems that there are a lot of brigades in the armed forces of Ukraine, though there are not thousands of them. Their number varies from 100 to 150, if I'm not mistaken. If each brigade gets 2 to 3 groups of instructors, all of us are here, and we conduct training somehow, right? Just now, my assistant is bringing your colleagues to the proving ground, so you understand that it's not a problem to find a place for digging a trench or building a base. If we involve groups of instructors for brigades, separate units or battalions, it will speed up the whole process a lot. We will save time for logistics or program planning. We can select people on the ground based on understanding of their capabilities. They are more able for operating artillery, infantry, stormtrooper or anti-tank.
це більше противотанкіст.
If that solution does not come, could he spell out what that means for the Ukrainian army now?
Ви не переймайтесь, ми виживемо точно.
Don't you worry. We will survive anyway. The question is how hard it's going to be. Again, scaling. It's not the matter of scaling, it's the matter of time we lose. We don't manage it effectively. For instance, it took my soldiers 41 days, 29 of which they used for actual training. The trip itself, getting equipped and deployed, took 12 days. 12 days. That's half of the total period of training. We're already losing time here. We need high quality training. If a soldier doesn't keep up with what they physically can do, that is also a problem. If we launch a great program to train soldiers the way they become great stormtroopers in a 2-week time span, it's simply impossible, since 2 weeks is not enough for a soldier to even believe in the fact that he has already become a stormtrooper. The second important point here is that, of course, they're being trained there. They wallow in the mud, run in the fields, and are subject to various kinds of load. Though after coming back they think, oh, it all was there. They didn't do the same here, and they would have to repeat it all over again and train them on the basis of their own unit here, in Ukraine.
І приучувати їх саме на базі свого підрозділу діяти відповідно до таких рамок.
It seems like Pavlo has a very good understanding then of the limitations of Interflex. Does he think that his allies appreciate those as well?
Я точно знаю.
I know what my maximum plan looks like, and I also know what my minimum goal is. I mean, being prepared for the best but ready to accept anything that comes. But I have a clear vision of both my maximum and minimum plans, though I don't really know what our partners consider as their minimum and maximum goals.
Я не зовсім знаю план максимум, план мінімум у наших партнерів.
Why not?
А я не говорю, що вони не бачать, я говорю, я його не знаю.
I won't say they don't have it, I just don't know what it is.
А ви знаєте?
Do you know?
I don't know, no.
Ну от, я не знаю за того.
Neither do I. I don't know it either.
Are these conversations you have with them at all? And does this come from your personal experience of talking to counterparts in these armies?
А вони не знають. Це ж політичне рішення.
They don't know. It's a political decision. We're now trying to compare politics with military service. These are different things. Military follows orders, on every level, regardless of what those orders bring globally and strategically. The higher strategic level is a political one. What is the maximum goal our Western partners want to attain politically isn't reported anywhere. What we see is that it is definitely not providing us with enough equipment we require to get some results.
Він не заключається в тому, щоб наситити негайно технікою і щось з того, щоб вийшло.
We've spoken about the British side of this. What about the Ukrainian side? Does he think that the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian army and Ministry of Defence are all on the same page and understand the issues?
Та, це точно знають. Прям до дрібниць знають.
For sure, the Ukrainian government knows what's going on in the army. They know it in detail. Owing to decentralization of governance in Ukraine, our authorities operate locally. Over the past 2 weeks, I've had meetings with 11 heads of territorial communities of big cities, 30,000 plus of population each. Everyone knows not just that drones or vehicles are needed in some direction, but has a clear understanding of the problems in specific locations to be resolved.
Які проблеми по місцях.
You mentioned earlier about how NATO training involves, or NATO strategy involves lots of kit, lots of gear. Can you talk about what kind of kit you have? Do you have enough? And what's the quality of it when it arrives here in Ukraine?
Я думаю, читали?
Have you read the information of how Bradleys were delivered to Ukraine?
Чином було передання Україні Бредлі. Читали, ні?
They came and they wouldn't drive, and loads of them had to be sent back and repaired, is that right?
Ну, завести Бог з ним, типу...
There were no spare parts provided for them, and the general repair program wasn't introduced, so they just sent them to us thinking, do whatever you want with them.
What was the reaction of the soldiers when they received these things that were essentially useless?
My
reaction was simple. It doesn't work, so leave it. How can this mess surprise a guy like me who started in the army that consisted of just 100,000 recruits? I ordered 5 L200 pickup trucks from Japan. I thought it'd be better to meet my needs with them rather than with that old scrap metal that we received.
Could you tell us how we got those cars from Japan?
The company producing them had the best price. So we contacted the producer directly, and now they are being delivered by ocean, trying to avoid attacks by Houthis.
You spoke about the issue with the Bradleys. Has that changed now? Are you getting better kit in better condition, or are you still facing the same problems?
The problem is not even being solved. For the problem to disappear, some decisions must be made. What are those decisions? Let me tell you an example. Earlier, I could read reports of 3 to 4 military equipment transfers to Ukraine once a week. It was a year ago. Reports of massive aid to Ukraine appeared 3 to 4 times per week. Gear, military equipment, etc. Today, if at least one report like this appears in 2 weeks, it's really great. That means that Ukraine is still not forgotten.
Looking to the future then, we know that the military aid bill in America is held up, it might not pass. Could you give your thoughts on what that means for your troops on the front if that aid from America doesn't come?
We'll be assaulted by a full-scale and overpowering offensive. Closer to the summer, Russian forces will be ready to attack the area on the junction of Zaporizhia and Donetsk regions, and try to advance in the direction from the Kharkiv to Poltava regions. After that, the battle line will be extended, and the depth of the front line will get bigger as well. We will be able to break their logistic routes so they won't be able to prevail, even overpowering our forces. This line will freeze along the Dnipro River, and we will lose the territory of Ukraine, right up to the Dnipro.
We know that the Ukrainian army is constructing fortifications and defences. When you do that, when you're digging in, which strategy are you thinking? The NATO strategy of kind of mobile defence, active defence, or the more post-Soviet strategy of defending and just absorbing the pressure?
Neither of these ways. Our defence lines are built based on manoeuvre defence tactics with further transition to counter-offensive. This is that mix I've mentioned earlier. It implies taking into regard data about the enemy, first involving a 2-echelon division. That is, 2 divisions having different training backgrounds. The first one is infantry that works solely to hold the enemy. The whole division is involved in performing that task. No operative subordination, etc., etc. The second one, Special Forces Division, performs manoeuvrable defence with further counter-offensive. They will be the ones using hardware, since at the moment it is of no use at the 0 position, because its lifespan is no more than 2 minutes until the first FPV drone spots it. So the counter-offensive must be launched by the second echelon, including enhancing defence on the fronts. This is what this mix looks like. The first division is focused on defence and deterring the initial attack of the enemy.
Earlier, Pavlo talked about the mindset of the Ukrainian army and how it's changing. Does he think it's changing fast enough?
This is not an issue at all. The issue is whom we are sending to the front line, what the personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine are made of. It consists of the mobilised staff that has no idea of what a Soviet army actually is. They've never been draftees or contract soldiers of the Soviet army. Even if some of them served before it was in the times when that army was being destroyed and the concept of the army was considered as something negative. To say, oh great, we're using NATO standards now, we have to analyse whether they are viable in our reality. Since the Vietnam War, the US started introducing a system of operations, so they plan missions. They don't have a concept of long-term combat or prolonged warfare. This is why this NATO approach is not entirely viable in times of war.
Could he go into a little more detail, sort of on a really tactical level? Are there examples of NATO doctrine that they've tried and do not work? I think it'd be interesting if we imagine military people are listening, they want specifics. What isn't on a tactical level working?
When we were in Avdiivka the last time, 45 to 70 guided aerial bombs were dropped there. Not a single division would endure that many attacks if it had worked according to NATO standards, since NATO doctrine doesn't imply digging trenches. They, NATO, don't know how to work in small tactical groups under the direct guidance of a battalion commander. They consider any tactical task as a special operation. Right now, a transition period is getting started. I can see it. I mean this compromise in action, while one soldier is responsible for defending lines and the other one for offensive fronts. Well, right, that's how it should start. It usually begins at the level of a military company. It consists of 3 platoons, so 2 of them are responsible for the defence. They are involved solely on defensive lines. The 3rd platoon is used only for storming, assault. They are 3 autonomous structures. I'm sure that very soon we will extend this same system to the level of battalions, moving further until 1 battalion is responsible for assault and the other one is used just for defence, separately from each other. This will lead to conditional decentralisation in the army, when a commander of a division or a battalion that is responsible solely for defence focuses all of its resources, including planning, just on defending lines, while a commander of a division or a battalion that conducts assault is focused exclusively on planning an offensive. In this case, a soldier would clearly perform just a specific range of tasks and won't be a jack of all trades, an engineer, a sniper, a machine gunner or a cook.
Штурмовиком, інженером і в тому же самому оборонцем і кухарем. Оборонні дії.
Right now we have a special operations battalion with a rifle regiment standing right next to it and a para and stormtroopers battalion behind them, and all the 3 of them implement the same tasks. I'm 100% sure we will abandon such a doctrine soon. I'm sure that our military and political leaders got a simple set of actions to introduce an echelon defence doctrine that includes offensives that would help conduct these defensive operations and get territories back. To make this tactic work, the whole training should be not a basic but specific one to prepare professionals. Regarding the resources for military divisions, they should get more hardware and weapons than just human resources. A dead person cannot be resurrected, and I keep repeating that there is only one issue that is not being solved, and it's not the equipment or weapons. I mean the life lost. If a life is lost, there is nothing to be discussed after.
You mentioned shell hunger there. How bad is the situation?
Погано це приблизно рік назад. Зараз вона...
What we call a bad situation is what it was a year ago. Today the situation with shells and gear is just horrible. When I get 20 projectiles for a mortar per week, while one Russian mortar fires 50 to 60 projectiles at one Ukrainian position per day, this is what makes this situation horrible. Imagine, a column of Russian hardware goes at you. They assault. If we shoot at them with a mortar, the next day we will have just machine guns to fire at the next column of tanks coming. The only thing preventing Russia's breakthrough on all fronts is FPV drones, 90% of which are being provided by volunteers or military divisions themselves, and are loaded with explosives by guys from those divisions or sappers.
Talking about the volunteers then, how important have they been for your troops? Talking about people bringing equipment, cars, etc. from other countries to Ukraine. What difference has that made?
Вона не була важливою, вона...
It has been and still is extremely important. Their assistance assures the direction for a division to be developed the way I or my brigade's commander see it. A military mechanism of any country is slow and hardly mobile. Volunteers help to speed it up. They made the first FPV and land drones. They were the ones who invented wings that helped to do reconnaissance tasks in a distance of more than 50 kilometres. With their help, the first boats that made warships of the Russian Federation were created. All of this know-how was created by volunteers and partially introduced by the state itself. Volunteers managed to work on the military programme and satiated the Ukrainian troops so much that the government and the armed forces of Ukraine chose to cooperate with them in the framework of legal terms.
How could the government help them to do more of what they're doing?
So, for an invention to be used by the armed forces in Ukraine or any other country, it must go through experimental operation, which implies around 6 months of testing in the rear zone. The procedure is the same for any invention up to a radio-electronic reconnaissance innovation or an artillery projectile. For instance, the NURS, a non-guided missile, was invented by volunteers to be applicable for an artillery system of a mini-grad type. Pipes were taken from helicopter rocket launchers, then they were calibrated and are now being used as mini-grads at 0 positions. After they did so, re-equipped and then delivered nearly several hundreds of such things to the front line, Valery Zaluzhny, who was commander-in-chief at that time, ordered that they should be officially introduced to the military doctrine because Ukraine's armed forces needed a lot of missiles. But the military mechanisms didn't have a solution that would help provide missiles for helicopter launches to divisions that didn't have helicopters at their disposal.
It seems like this is a very crucial period of time for the Ukrainian army, for your forces on the front line. What would you want Western military leaders and politicians to hear and to understand?
I would like to say that the turning point of the war was on February 24th, 2022, and this so-called crucial moment which is unfolding at the moment has been artificially created by our Western partners. I would like to ask our Western partners to stop creating these sorts of turning points that are aimed at pushing us towards a compromise with Russia.
Для того, щоб ми пішли на компроміс.
We spoke about your your soldiers' experience in Britain and the disconnect you saw with the British Army and the politicians. We know that senior government people in the UK listen to this. So imagine that I am Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. What's your message to me?
Я б йому сказав, що партнерство...
I would tell him that partnership implies assistance, even in the hardest times. It is not the hardest time for Ukraine now. There can be worse. Though, to go ahead towards victory, mutual assistance is vital and should be supported by actions, not just by words. There is one joke regarding gratitude Ukraine's armed forces often resort to. It looks like a pat on somebody's back, so Ukraine doesn't need gratitude to be manifested as patting on its back.
Дякувати похлопуванням по плечу не треба.
Is there anything we haven't spoken about that he would like to say or we should address or listeners should know about?
Ні, тут же все дуже просто.
All is so clear, in fact. When we call each other friends and partners ready to help each other, we can't assist with one thing and then refrain from helping with the other one. You cannot stand thinking of whether to provide or not provide missiles, whether fighter jets are still needed or not. If all of us as a coalition are fighting against our common enemy, we either keep beating it together or we just say bye to each other and go home. You know, we are reaching the point of thinking that metal costs more than a human life. When we basically start accepting it as some sort of normalcy, we will cease being partners or friends. The coalitions will just lose their purpose.
Створювати ці коаліції.
Could I just ask you to describe what we're seeing in your office? Could you tell us about the weapon there, the sword and the gun?
По зброї, зброї...
These are two trophy machine guns that belong to Russians. This one is from 2022 and the other one from 2023. When we reached close to Chernihiv in 2022 and got into a fight with the Russians there, we eliminated the enemy group, so I took one of these rifles as a trophy and customized it for myself.
How would he characterize the Russians' fighting ability at the moment?
Та просто всі воюють, реально всі.
Of course, their military preparation can't be disregarded, but the most important thing is the scale of firepower that they have at the front line. I participated in the Battle of Donetsk airport, so when I heard stories that it was compared to the Battle of Stalingrad, it looks to me as a childish fight now, compared to what is happening today. I can't say that the Russians are fighting better or worse. Back in 2015, I realised that we are fighting a mirror. The only difference is that this mirror had the ability to multiply. Their manpower is bigger than we'd like it to be. We mostly work on offensive plus counter-offensive and eliminating their manpower, though it gets bigger again after we do so, and again the next day we reach another Russian position. The hard thing is not the quality of their troops, but the quantity.
Зменшується. Ти проходиш чуть-чуть або утримуєш позицію, і завтра їх опять багато. Тому
I recall a situation. My whole battalion stood creating a defensive area and a company of a neighbouring battalion suddenly left their positions. It faced 4 Russian tanks that started crushing the company, so the soldiers shifted to the second echelon, as we call it. It was a very bad decision. They had to dig deeper trenches rather than leave. The Russians actually wanted to push that company back so they could occupy the positions. I got really sad at that moment. I left the vehicle 3 kilometres away. This was the distance a vehicle couldn't go through, so I went on foot. I went along the planted area with my rifle. It may sound funny now. So I was going there, very angry, wearing just my body armour, having just a rifle and 1 cartridge clip. So I kept walking, across the field, moving from one planted area to the other one, very angry. Hearing soldiers hiding there, I was angry, swearing, screaming at them, and walking further. Then I saw a group of these Ukrainian soldiers who retreated. I came up to them asking, "Why are you standing here? Give me at least a grenade launcher." I expected that they would come with me, but they just gave me a grenade launcher and didn't join. I placed it on a Kalashnikov rifle and kept going. I was just 1 kilometre away from a position thinking, fuck, the Russians must have already taken that position. After I placed that grenade launcher on a rifle, I remembered that I hadn't actually taken any grenades. So I took it away and put it in my pocket. It was really heavy. Well, I also had just 1 cartridge clip. So I thought to myself that I had to come closer from the side to the Russians and make them panic a bit. When I was 400, 300 metres close to the Russian position, I noticed their shadows moving there. The position itself wasn't a small one. There were around 110 infantry soldiers. I turned back and heard some noise behind me. I thought I should lie down on my back and get ready to shoot. But then I hear the voice saying, "Commander, hey, Commander, that's us." 2 of my scouts approached. One of them was my deputy commander, and the other 2 were snipers. So the 6 of us managed to take over the company support point. Then I sent 2 scouts to get our infantry. So we enforced our position. After an hour, there were 16 of us there on the positions, including me. So the 16 of us managed to hold the company support point, which has been controlled by us until now. Moreover, we even managed to advance from there.
Контролем і навіть з нього просунулись вперед. Висновок ці взагалі,
The conclusion that can be made based on this story is that I was fortunate to use my personal example and show everyone I know, including those soldiers who left the position, that both Ukrainian and Russian soldiers have some fear. The situations and the stories are all the same. It's all about the mindset that helps get over oneself and eventually win.
рахунок свого характеру перемагають ті, хто переборює себе.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. This episode of Ukraine the Latest was edited and produced by Lillian Fawcett, Rachel Porter, Adley Pujman-Ponte and John Cadigan.